Hello everyone, I'm Mark, and I'm here to bring you the story of the rise and fall of Circuit City Stores Incorporated from 1949 to 2009. They started in 1949 and they officially died on January 16, 2009 in bankruptcy court, which ordered the company to liquidate all of its assets and close all of their stores by March 31st, 2009. This is the logo that they eventually had when they died. I particularly do not like this logo because you shouldn't have your name if you can avoid it in the logo. At least that's what I've heard from a TED Talk. Some guy who studies logos, and the best logos don't have words in them, usually. Alright, so here's a store from the 1980s design. And I quite like the front entrance kind of stands out. There you go. It literally stands out. And, they eventually remodeled a lot of their stores and they lost that particular design. Okay, so for my methodology, I primarily used the SEC Form 10Ks from Circuit City from 1994 to 2009. I looked at the annual ones. I would like to have seen more, but 1994 was the earliest one that they had on file. I also used media reports for my primary sources, which were quite useful, provided some insight to the company. And then the secondary sources, I used a whole bunch, but one of the main ones is Retailing Triumphs and Blunders, Victims of Competition in the New Age of Marketing Management by Ronald D. Mitchman and Alan J. Greco. Also, I read an essay from Ali Hortsu and Chad Severson, The Ongoing Evolution of U.S. Retail, a Format Tug of War. Alright, here we go. Here's one of their Horizon format stores. Quite today-ish look, kind of bland if you ask me. I like the old 1980s look, but that's just my opinion. This was introduced in 2000, so. Alright, so who is Circuit City? Well, they're a consumer electronics retailer founded by Samuel S. Wurtzel and Abraham L. Hecht. Their first store was founded in Richmond, Virginia, 1949. They originally started as a TV retailer called Ward's Company, and they eventually expanded into major appliances such as refrigerators, stoves, dishwashers, and consumer electronics like PCs, VCRs, DVD players by the 1980s. And in the 1984, they changed their name to Circuit City Stores to better reflect their consumer electronics sales, and they were renowned for their customer service until the mid-2000s. They had an enduring philosophy and dedication of its top-of-the-class salespeople, but it declined in the mid-2000s because of personnel changes that I'll talk about later. In 1996, they lost their number one consumer electronics retailer title to Best Buy in terms of total sales, and by 1999 Best Buy exceeded Circuit City in earnings, which was a really big blow for them. Okay, so I read Retailing Triumphs and Blunders, Victims of Competition and in the New Age of Marketing Management. It's quite a useful book, provided me some theoretical insight on how retailers succeeded or failed. So the authors stressed these 5 points that determine the retailer's success or failure. So the first one is innovation. So you want to try to change the game. You want to bring product to market almost sooner than demand. You also want to diversify. You want to keep your revenue stream as differentiated as possible, because you never know when, for example, PCs might start to fade away or TVs might start to fade away. And then another point was target market segmentation. So that means that retailers, they want to focus on specific parts of the market, because the old days of having 1, 2, or 3 types of consumer groups or classes is clearly over. Nowadays we have single mothers, single fathers probably. We still have the 2 parents, the old traditional market. They have like single men, single women. Who knows? There maybe could even be other segments of the market. Do dogs count? I guess dogs can't buy their own stuff. I guess they could. But anyway, don't want to get too mixed up into that. Third, there's image. The retailer's image. What are you? What do you represent? What are you good at? So it's always important for a retailer to have a image with consumers, a strong image if as that's the plan, I guess you could say. Human resources, that's another important point. You want to stress the search for potential talented employees. Who is your weakest link? You want to keep your company or your retailer front lines of your, what you call them, salespeople, or just people that interact with your customers to be as strong as possible. And then I guess it used to be important, not anymore, but this point of physical environmental resources. So you want to, for example, back in the 80s, you wanted to push for huge stores. They call them superstores. And, that would technically improve your ability to attract customers. That was a thing back in the day. There's also, the size of your community, size of the markets, and that was a pretty important theoretical basis into understanding retail. And then this, Good to Great to Gone, the 60-Year Rise and Fall of Circuit City by Alan L. Wurtzel. And this book gave me the insider's perspective to Circuit City's rise and fall. It was quite revealing about the stuff that happened behind the scenes. And now, behind the curtains, we have the successful rise of Circuit City. So I use the 5 theoretical points from the Retailing Triumphs and Blunders book. So innovation, the Circuit City always aimed for opportunities in selling TVs initially. They eventually moved into refrigerators and other home appliances. And that was smart because in the 50s, people started buying homes, and you need to stock your homes with TVs, refrigerators, microwaves eventually, and all those home appliances, and Circuit City nailed it. They also had target market segmentation, so they clearly focused on their main market, which is homeowners, since they sold a whole bunch of TVs, refrigerators. And then in terms of their image, they pretty much always focused on being number one and helping customers. They're always sales oriented as well. And if you look up their commercials on YouTube from the 1990s, I don't know how you describe it. Not trendy, but music feel to it, to their commercials, which is pretty cool. I mean, they're selling you something, so they got to make it somewhat attractive sounding, where they always ended with this slogan, where service is state of the art. I can't match the tempo, but that's pretty close. It's a pretty cool slogan, state-of-the-art service. And then in terms of physical environmental resources, they're the early pioneers of superstores. And in the 1980s, they remodeled their stores with a racetrack focus. And that was formulating the walkways into some sort of like rhombus-like circle. And they had all their merchandise on the sides and in the middle of the rhombus circle thing. And hey, it worked. I mean, they were killing it in the 80s, so masterful. And then in the human resources, they had a very early novel hiring practice where Circuit City hired people who previously failed in their endeavors or occupations beforehand to become their salesmen, which was quite an intriguing practice, and it worked. So that was pretty cool because, psychologically, I'm guessing that by giving someone a second chance, they'll work as hard as they possibly can to make up for their previous failures, as well as supporting their new employers. But in 1984, they professionalized their hiring practices by hiring Bill Zierden, a former professor of University of Virginia, who eventually worked at Circuit City as their vice president of human resources. And the executives, I believe, met him in a lecture that he gave, and they hired him on the spot, which was pretty crazy. But hey, it worked because Zierden pushed sales and management training. He recruited top talent. He made stores accountable for hiring, firing, promoting, and counseling their employees, and HR was only supposed to aid and assist. I mean, that was quite innovative, I would imagine, because HR was a truly genius under Zierden, because stores would know whether to hire or fire people, and they wouldn't need to contact administration. That's kind of a waste of time, wouldn't it? So being more direct, I believe, was very strong and positive for Circuit City. And now we flip to the dark side. I'll reveal what I think led to the decline and fall of Circuit City, and I believe why they fell was because of their leadership. They made a lot of mistakes, which is kind of the same argument that the Good to Great to Gone book talked about, such as, there are other reasons, the economic decline by the time they died in 2009, and competition. All right. So poor choices lose everything. Well, this is the reality, and failure obviously doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of steps that you have to take before everything collapses. So in 1986 to 2000, Richard Sharp was CEO, and he was a successor to Alan Wurtzel. And in 1988, they made their first major mistake. And late in that year, Circuit City decided not to buy the ailing Best Buy for $30 million. And Best Buy was in deep trouble, and they could have failed. And they managed to survive. But the problem is, Sharp's infinite genius, he decided to compete head-to-head against Best Buy and open stores in Minnesota, and this failed horribly because they did not expect the Best Buy customers were so loyal. I mean, this was clearly a cheaper solution than $30 million, but still, I would think that you wouldn't have underestimated Best Buy so much, but in hindsight, it's clear that they screwed up big time. And in June 16th, 1999, DivX dies. It cost them $207 million in February, as of February 28, 1999, to get this program running. And in fiscal year 2000, they had to take a loss of $114 million to cover killing off DivX. I mean, this is a weird new technology that Circuit City and other electronic equipment manufacturers created. I think it was like an alternative to the DVD system, and somehow through the internet they could figure out who watched the DVD and charge them. It was weird. I would imagine that the dial-up was still a thing, and I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be that effectively ran in terms of the internet back then, but that's just my opinion. It clearly never took off, and that's why they killed it. It cost way too much money. So we also have superstore expansion in the 80s that was going on, 90s. They settled for locations that were second class, and consequences just killed them later because these inferior locations got worse and worse in terms of declining revenue, and that's obviously a recipe for disaster. And in 2000 2005, W. Allen McCullough becomes CEO. By this point, Circuit City is a clear number 2 versus Best Buy, and during his term, he was known for high executive turnover. People left, I guess, because it was a sinking ship, but I would imagine McCullough wasn't exactly the best guy to work with. He was also known to be a cost cutter, and he's also known, on a positive side, a man of ideas. Although the problem was he had no concrete plan to achieve them. That was pretty sad. He's known to have a sharp mind, calm demeanor, and strong work ethic, and he charged up the ranks pretty quickly. That's how he became CEO. So during his tenure, he was a notorious cost cutter. He cut things such as regular sales training and replaced it with computerized sales training to save $16 million, and that was pretty dumb. Because why would you be training your salespeople in front of a computer? Shouldn't you be training them in front of real people? I mean, you're not selling your stuff to a machine, are you? You're selling your merchandise to a human, to a real person. So that kind of probably caused some problems later on, but I'm pretty sure the consequences didn't really happen because they died years later. In 2003, after a poor Christmas sales, Circuit City fired 3,900 of their best sales commissioned workers. They did that to save $130 million a year, which was a general surprise to them, and they eventually somehow killed off commissioned staff members, but they still had them later. They did kill off that policy of commissioned workers. And for example, if you want to know why, an average Circuit City salesman earned around $30,000 a year, which was $15 an hour. The top salespeople earned $50,000 a year and $25 per hour. In contrast, Best Buy paid their salesmen around $10 an hour, and they were the first to kill off the sales commission thing. Clearly, Circuit City was paying high wages to their workers, their sales workers, and that wasn't a good thing under McCullough. So in 2004, they acquired Intertan for $300 million. I don't see how this was a good idea, but they acquired this Canadian consumer electronics retailer, which is similar to Radio Shack. And they also used the name Radio Shack in Canada, and Radio Shack, in response, because of conflict of interest and probably making money in their name, they sued Circuit City, and that dragged on for a while, cost Circuit City millions to rebrand the Intertan Radio Shack locations to The Source. Among other things, McCullough hired a fellow by the name of Kim McGuire, a 20-year veteran of Target stores, This guy, McGuire, destroyed the human capital by cost cutting. He fired well-paid merchandise buyers, pissed off vendors, and in 2.5 years, 12 buyers out of 16 for Circuit City left. And allegedly, McGuire alienated women. He clearly disrespected women for some reason. I don't know, I wasn't there, but that's what Wurtzel said in his book, and I wouldn't be surprised. And eventually, McGuire was forced to resign in 2004. And in October 2004, the future CEO, Philip J. Schoonover, who was a Best Buy veteran from 1995 to 2004, became the executive vice president of Chief Merchandising Officer. In 2006, he became CEO. And then in winter 2006, selling TVs turned out to be a nightmare because Circuit City had too much inventory and they couldn't get rid of it. A horrific happening in 2007 where 3,400 of their remaining best sales commissioned workers were fired. This was a complete surprise. No one knew this was happening. The salesmen were completely shocked when they lost their jobs when they showed up for work, and that is very sad. I would be pissed off if I was some poor guy who was working there and show up for work and you're escorted out because you're fired. Complete surprise. No one knew. It destroyed morale in the stores. Also in 2007, they had costly IT upgrades that cost tens of millions. And I don't know why you're upgrading your aging IT infrastructure. Even though it's old, it's so expensive to overhaul that stuff. And it's highly likely that it screws up everything, slows down everything. And they eventually dumped their IT off to somebody else to manage. I believe it was IBM that they dumped it off to. Quite saddening. Alright, and then we have credit. So Circuit City had a hugely profitable subsidiary, a credit card bank. They formed this credit card bank in November 1990 under the name of First North American National Bank. It was a hugely influential organization, and in 5 years was worth over $1 billion in terms of the financial instruments that they were dealing with. And in 2003, U.S. regulators forced Circuit City and other retailers to sell off their credit card operations because for some reason it was bad to mix up your loaning business with retail. I mean, look what happened in 2008, 2009 in the housing market. Why didn't the regulators go after the financial institutions? Instead, you went after the retailers. Weird world. Anyway, Circuit City was too dependent on First North American National Bank for their profits because it was clearly obvious after they sold off the business that everything went downhill. So in fiscal year 2004, they sold the generic bank card business for $244 million. And in fiscal year 2005, Circuit City sold their private label card, which is quite valuable, for $457 million. Profits after that just could not be sustainable, and they just collapsed because they were surprisingly way too dependent on issuing credit and servicing loans. Alright, so while that went away, they also did some pretty horrible things, such as in 2001, they offloaded their major appliance business. They phased it out because they claimed it was too much competition and appliance sales softened and profit margins were slim. So the space was replaced by electronics, copiers, cameras, computer software, peripherals, video games, software, DVDs, movies, and cell phones. So in fiscal year 1990, 19% of the revenue came from major appliances. 1995, there was a pretty plateauing year of 15% revenue, and by 2001, when they were phasing it out, major appliances only represented 7% of their revenue, and Circuit City was the number 2 in terms of major appliance sales, so they weren't doing bad by any means. They were behind Sears out of all retailers, but I guess Sears was a powerhouse back in the day, and they were the number 1 retailer of major appliances. Once Circuit City left, Lowe's, Home Depot, and Best Buy were competing for the number 2 spot. Quite shocking that Sears was number 1 in retailing major appliances back in the day. Pretty crazy. And as you can see in this graph, we have the green line for appliances compared to what Circuit City eventually believed would save them, which was IT and home office. As you can see, I have 2 lines because Circuit City didn't categorize IT until 1997, and then they stopped categorizing home office in 2000. But IT and home office shared a lot of the same products, so that's why I threw on the data on here as well, because it's pretty tough to compare IT and home office with appliances without one or the other. As you can see, Circuit City's appliance sales from 1990, they were around 20%, and then the steadily declined into the teens and then eventually plateaued before they offloaded it. And home office was a growing segment, as well as IT into the 30% area. But the problem was that their so-called profit margins problems became a bigger problem because, as you all know, computers eventually depreciated because just technology is cheaper, grew cheaper. All those DVDs, software, CDs was a waste of time because eventually all that stuff was digitized. So that was another killer for them. So in the end, major appliances were still quite important for the industry, but for some reason, Circuit City decided it was a better idea to offload it. And that was a real killer for them. Alright, and then behind that, probably the worst one of all would be the stock buybacks. In my opinion, they're probably the most heinous errors. Dividends, played a smaller role of burning money for Circuit City, but the biggest problem was the stock buybacks where they burned hundreds of millions. So the total was $966.868 million from fiscal year 2004 to fiscal year 2008. All that money was wasted. They could have used that to survive the Great Recession, and in the critical light, I would say that the cash could have been used way more strategically. So unfortunately, this corrupt bargain occurred, and you may be wondering why I call this a corrupt bargain. Think of it this way. If you're a board member or a large stakeholder of the company, you would approve of their stock buybacks to prop up or artificially increase their stock price in the short term, so you could dump your shares of the company to make some money before Circuit City collapsed and your shares would be worthless. You could also think of it in terms of a classical economics. The more demand of a limited good, the shares of Circuit City, then the share price would increase. The dividends I also thought was an issue, but in general, companies stick to their dividend payouts until catastrophic economic conditions appear. The stock buybacks just wasted too much money. And then you may be wondering, the significance of all this. Circuit City's demise is brutal, like any company collapses. By the bankruptcy proceedings, 34,000 employees were gone. They lost their jobs. Then another problem is the real estate. As you can see here, empty lots for lease. Circuit City, when they died, they left all their stuff wide open, all that real estate. Some of the real estate was filled in by companies like Michaels, I guess, in terms of this picture, and they still kept their old format. I guess it's too expensive to remodel. As you can see, the protruding entrance that used to be Circuit City's is now used for Michaels. And yeah, Circuit City, they once stood at the pinnacle of electronics retail, and they are now dead. And you may be wondering, they have less consumer options. That's clearly a bad thing. There's less competition among electronics retailers and mass merchants. And in late 2000s, they actually tried to revive Circuit City as an e-retailer, like on the internet, but that failed. And now the owners of the Circuit City name appear to be done with trying to bring back the dead retailer. And I personally think, Circuit City probably deserves to stay where they are now, defunct, because just all that suffering, do you really want to go through that again? And this time in a retail market, which was even worse than when they left. And that's why I think that that's clearly not going to happen. And what do you see now? You see Best Buy, the winner that stood triumphant in 2009 when Circuit City closed their doors. Best Buy is the #1 brick-and-mortar electronics retailer in the U.S. They seem to be doing all right. I looked at their SEC Form 10Ks of last year, and they are quite profitable, around $1 billion for each of the last 5 years. So in Circuit City's death, the great success story was CarMax. They started in 1993. CarMax, formed by Circuit City, was an idea from the CEO Richard Sharp, Alan Wurtzel, and Austin Ligon. And in 1981, the CEO and other executives realized that they needed to diversify. Circuit City's saturation as an electronics retailer was reaching its peak and was inevitable, and they saw that the used car market was fractionalized heavily and quite, spread out. And they saw this was a prime opportunity for centralization and to make the market more efficient. And in fiscal year 2018, they had $17.12 billion in sales and $664 million in profits. Quite solid, and I hope that CarMax lives on as the last vestige of Circuit City. I've read rumors that supposedly CarMax has peaked or is peaking, and I do not know if that is true or not, but I really hope that is not, because CarMax, they do a good job. When I go out and drive around the city, I see quite a lot of CarMax cars rolling around. So I'd imagine that CarMax is doing a good job. And then this nightmare is finally over for Circuit City, but the new nightmare that every retailer and technology company must fear is the one and only Amazon.com Incorporated. They have amazing growth numbers in terms of revenue. They keep growing at the expense of brick and mortar retailers. And now I'll discuss something very weird that I found in a news database. Thank you, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, that I can still read and research from their database access. So I learned that Amazon.com Incorporated partnered with Circuit City to fulfill some electronics purchases. This news article came from the Wall Street Journal in 2001. It revealed that Amazon.com does not buy Sony electronics directly from Sony, the manufacturer, and instead Amazon bought them from Sony electronics resellers, and Amazon allegedly did not like the pricing because naturally they would mark up the price. And at the end of the day, Amazon partnered with Circuit City. And this was quite a shocker because it does make sense, because Amazon.com in 2001 was probably a joke compared to the large electronics manufacturers who wanted to maintain their relations with brick and mortar retailers. I have a feeling that Amazon.com makes these temporary alliances / deals / partnerships to gain advantages and secrets from their partners. Quite a cynical thought there. But when I look at the deaths of Circuit City and my previous project subject, Borders Group Incorporated, I gain this understanding that Amazon just happens to partner with these clearly desperate and close to dead companies to do something, especially when those weakened companies are like clawing to survive. And I think that Amazon.com is a retailing god. Hear me out. They possess great advantages like quick delivery, ease of use, and Amazon Prime. They also possess, disadvantages like the lack of brick and mortar locations, although Amazon bought Whole Foods Market recently, and that has kind of fixed their problem a little bit. But Amazon's also exposed in terms of expensive transportation costs, because it's quite expensive nowadays to transport material from, one state to the next, from one country to the other, and then all the transportation and logistic companies that function in a smaller, more direct version, companies like UPS, FedEx, the US Postal Service, and probably DHL and other transportation companies that work with Amazon to deliver their packages. And let's just wrap this up. Here's my bibliography of primary sources, just all the US SEC Exchange Commission Form 10-Ks, as well as some media reports. My bibliography of secondary sources, mostly just pictures and some of the academic sources that I used. And I will include most of these in the description below, so you can check out some of the articles that I read. And rest in peace, Circuit City Stores Incorporated. You lived for 60 years, and you did as best as you can. Made a name for yourself as the #1 consumer electronics retailer before that game was over for you, and I salute you. If you liked the video and learned something, give the video a thumbs up, or thumbs down if you didn't learn anything. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you are new. I have my Twitter below if you want to follow that for updates. And leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought, especially if you're a Circuit City person, because I only went to Circuit City once that I remember when I was a kid. It's quite a dull store, but clearly the days were quite past it by the time I went. But anyway, thank you for watching. This is World Town FC, united to triumph.